Hi everybody, I don't know if you saw it, but recently there was a documentary on Netflix about these things right here, fungi and mushrooms. Now it concentrated mostly on their natural history and what they were used for in medicine, but these things have a surprising broad use. There's something like 1.5 million species of mushrooms and fungi out there. That's 6 times more than all the other discovered plant species. Of those 1.5 million, only about 20,000 of them produce a fruiting body, which is what this is. It's the bit of the mushroom that we can see. The rest of the mushroom is actually underground. They form a network of roots. These roots are called mycelium. Now, underneath the ground there are so many mycelium that they reckon in every footstep you take there's something like 300 miles of mycelium. That's just crazy. These mycelium form a network, a dense network of interconnected nodes. And in 1 square metre there are more nodes than there are in the internet. Across the entire Earth there are more nodes than there are in people's brains. And these nodes and these networks are able to communicate with each other. They communicate with each other in the same way that our brain does with electrochemical systems. They also link trees to each other, allow trees to communicate and all that kind of thing. And every time you find out something about a mushroom or a fungi, it's an absolutely astonishing fact. Now, of course, we've dealt with these for most of our lives and most of our history as a human species, but it's always been limited to basically 3 things. That is food, medicine and recreational drug use in the form of magic mushrooms. And that's really our everyday contact. And as I say, when I was a kid, my everyday contact was that thing. It's all we know about them. But when we start to look deeper into them, then they are truly astonishing. Now, that, which is a bit more of a whole earth attitude, coupled with a move away from extractive technology, because what we used to do with this stuff obviously is go and grab a plant, see what it might be useful for, and then extract the hell out of it for the useful component that we were looking for. And that's still done to a degree, because of course these things split up into families, and there's one whole family called decomposers, and that's the things we use for beer and cheese and wine. But because they will decompose any hydrocarbon, the enzymes they produce will also decompose oil spills. But there is a big move away from that extractive technology to working more in conjunction, and this is where the mycelium come into their own. And most plastics aren't in fact virgin plastics, they're quite often composite materials. If you think about glass fibre, it's a composite of a resin and a fiberglass, and that makes the plastic. And most plastics are like that. They use a large proportion of filler to make a composite material rather than using the entire virgin plastic all by itself. Now, when a mushroom or a fungus grows into a material, and here we're talking about things like wood and sawdust and rice husk and all that sort of stuff, then the mycelium penetrate that in a 3D network, and that 3D network joins up. And the mycelium are protein strands, and actually protein strands that when dried are stronger than silk. And as they penetrate that material and form a 3-dimensional network, they effectively glue everything together. They make it a solid lump or a composite material. So it's the Dutch who are really into this. It's the University of Utrecht where they're doing some of the really basic science. And what they're finding is that just the growing conditions can change the nature of the mycelium that they grow into things that are going to be hard plastic-like, or they can be rubbery, or they can be like cork, or they can be like wood, or they can be like paper. It's astonishing how many replacement materials can be grown from a mushroom by changing slightly the growing conditions. And it has been put into practice. There's a designer called Eric Clarenbeek, and he produced a 3D printed chair. What he did was print the mould out of a potato starch based plastic, filled it with a mushroom organic mix. I think he used straw, allowed it a couple of days to grow, and then cooked it in an oven. And the oven cooking kills the mushroom, dries it out, and fixes everything in place, which means there's no risk really of species contamination if you were to post this around the world, because basically the mushroom is dead. And the really cool thing about this material is it's lightweight, it's strong, it's fire resistant, it's water resistant, and it's been taken up by another company called Ecovative. Ecovative are using this technique to produce materials for packaging. Packaging is one of those almost shameful uses of plastic where we are deliberately making something that is designed to be thrown away and to go into landfill and does not decompose. So Ecovative have tackled that, and they're making packaging products that are better than the plastic, and yet you can just put into your garden at their end of use, which is essentially when you receive them. So it's a much more encompassing vision of what plastics in this particular use are. Ecovative go on the idea that they're using fewer resources, they're using less energy, they've taken account of the end of life. They argue about the life cycle of plastic development, how basically it came from milk, went to oil, and the future is going to be in mycelium. Now, it's not only in these areas that you're looking at. When you're thinking about a company like Mediamatic, for instance, who are trying to promote this idea and involved in growing shoes, which I thought was super cool, it is also entering the space race. Now, the space race, one of the greatest problems with it, of course, is space debris. There are some astonishing facts and figures about space satellites. When I think about space satellites, all I really think about is Sputnik and the International Space Station. That's about it. But there are 6,900 satellites flying around there above our heads, of which only about 4,000 are functioning. The rest are just zipping around waiting to fall back to Earth. And this is the space debris, the space junk that NASA is really worried about, because these things zip around at something like 16,700 miles per hour. That's faster than a bullet. And of course, when they break up a little bit, those big bits that you can see, and remember your average satellite is about the size of a washing machine, they get into little bits that are still zipping around like nuts and bolts and pieces of metal. And they hit other satellites at something about, I think it's 520 collisions per month. These break off little more bits that continue to zip around and lead to something called the Kessler syndrome. So a little bit hit a big bit, knock off loads of other little bits, they zip around and hit more satellites, and they create more little bits in orbit hitting more satellites, and so you get this rolling effect of things. Now, the launch rate of satellites is going up exponentially. SpaceX have got this plan for a mega network of satellites that we can have to use the internet, as does Amazon. SpaceX are launching batches of 60 at the rate of 300 per month. That's astonishing. And they plan to build a network of 12,000 mini satellites. Amazon are planning its own network of something like 3,260-ish mini satellites to create their own internet broadband service by a network of satellites above our heads. So satellites are crowding the space, and of course they're tremendously expensive. They just hang around there, they don't break up particularly well, and they don't decompose. Using the techniques of Utrecht and the things that have been discovered on making composites using mycelium growing through wood and straw and that sort of stuff, there are now experiments to build satellites out of fungus. Plants amaze me, actually. I don't know if you've ever seen a time lapse of a root grow, but when a plant root grows through the soil, it twists and turns and moves almost as if it was an earthworm hunting for food. And I guess in a sense, it is a living organism hunting for food. That root is hunting nutrients, but that time-lapse behaviour gives it an animalistic quality, twisting and turning and interweaving in a dense network of roots, because those roots, called mycelium, intertwine in the fungi's food source, which is just about anything really, because fungi, of course, are all about decomposition, breaking things down and returning nutrients. So if you give them rice husks or bits of wood or corn shells or anything, those myceli will penetrate, twist, turn and bind everything together in a solid lump. And that's what's got everybody excited, because that solid lump is incredibly solid, and they're starting to use it as a building material. Basically what you do is you take your starter, which can be sawdust or just about anything, pop it into a mould, add some fungi spores, water it and leave it for a few days, and the myceli will grow through that mass and bind it together as a block. If you then take that block and heat it at about 60 or 70 degrees centigrade, then it will dry the block and kill the fungi, but leave the mycelium in place. And those mycelium, once they're dry and in place, are stronger than silk. So it's like you've put little knots all the way through this material, tying it all together in one solid mass. And the behaviour of this material is somewhat surprising. Pound for pound, it's stronger than concrete. It's unbelievably fireproof, passing the chocolate test really easily. The chocolate test is where you put a bar of chocolate on one side and a blowtorch on the other, and you can set a fire to one side, but the heat doesn't travel through, and so the chocolate block doesn't melt. It remains solid. In terms of insulation properties, this mushroom block has better insulation properties than something like fiberglass. So it's fireproof. It's water resistant, it's mold resistant, it's lightweight, it's stronger pound for pound for concrete. What other kind of glorious material would you want in order to look at building things? Now, until recently, using these mushroom blocks, these fungal blocks, has been restricted to artists. Now, people like David Benjamin and Samuel Callacon, where they've built various structures on display, and what they've discovered, if they don't kill the fungi and they just pile the blocks up, those blocks grow into each other, creating an incredibly solid structure. But because there are a whole range of funguses with a whole range of qualities, black fungus, for instance, is resistant to radiation. That idea of radiation resistance and lightweight and the ability to grow your structure is what's got NASA interested. NASA is super interested in this because they're looking at building habitats on the moon or on Mars out of fungus. And I'm not joking, there's intensive research going on right now, because in terms of space exploration, of course, they have a number of really excellent properties. I mean, you can't discount fireproofness, but one of the things is you don't have to take all of the building material with you. The plan is to make a mould in the same way as the fungal chair, but collapsible. Fill that with an algal food and the fungal spores. Once you get it there, you can inflate it either with the gas or with the off-gassing of the algae, add a bit of water, let the fungus grow, and in a couple of weeks, you have a solid structure. That solid structure can be relatively massive, and some of the designs are just plain beautiful. But you haven't had to lug all of that material with you. All of that material has been grown in situ, and so you haven't had to ship it. So the ability to fold up, the lack of material you have to ship, the radiation resistance, the fireproof, the insulation properties, and to be honest, the speed of its growth is what's got them interested, with the possibility of making habitats in their completeness out of fungi. Now, there are other suggestions, of course, because where people are worried about the structural strength of doing things where you're combining that, so you're using it as an infill structure. And of course, there are questions that still haven't been answered. There is no plant that doesn't suffer from temperature in terms of growth. The lower the temperature, the slower it grows. The higher the temperature, within reason, the higher it grows. And of course, the temperature on Mars can go from very cold to very hot within a day. So there are worries about whether it will actually work, and there are experiments where they're simulating Martian and lunar conditions to see if it will. And the other issue, of course, is cross-contamination, because it would be perhaps the most dreadful thing ever if there is life on Mars of some kind or other and we take a fungus up there and promptly kill it all. How guilty would we feel? Well, some people not at all, but quite a lot of people, of course, would feel particularly bad about that, and the NASA scientists would certainly feel bad about that. So they're worried about cross-contamination. But this idea of heating it to kill it would prevent that cross-contamination to a degree. But again, a great deal of research is going into that side of things. But I think the real takeaway here is that the thing that is most interesting is that NASA are seriously considering this. And when you think about it, I mean, to my mind, the world is a fascinating place, and human beings do some amazing things. I mean, the first flight in 1903, the Apollo 11 landing in 1969, the first Martian mission in 1971. just astounds me. And now, of course, with the return to space that's on everybody's mind, with the exploration of Mars and the idea of building habitats off Earth so that we become a two-planet civilization, is where an awful lot of the drive is going. It is said that if a civilization can exist on two planets, it will be resistant to extermination. And of course, extinction events are something that plagues planet Earth. We've had 6 of them since the existence of planet Earth, and everybody is kind of worried that another extinction event is coming that maybe we're going to cause ourselves. But if we can get a two-planet civilization, then we have relative immunity to that event. So there's a whole focus on Mars exploration, space exploration, habitats on Mars, and surprisingly enough, this thing is at the heart of that development. They're truly an amazing creature. I say creature because they're more closely related to animals than they are plants, but of course they're owned far more by themselves. But they have astonishing properties. One of them, we've been looking at the Mycelium and how they've been used to make a glue to hold together structures of an amazing diversity. And of course somebody mentioned, what about using them for energy storage? Well, of course you can use them for energy storage. I mean, what can't you use these things for is becoming the question, isn't it? So I thought I would do something on energy storage and using mushrooms to create an energy storage device. Because what we're going to create is a supercapacitor, and the routine for this is pretty much always the same. You find whatever material it is you want, this time it's the mushroom, and carbonize it, because we need a carbon structure. The carbonization process is always the same routine, it's not that different. We're going to carbonize these at 700 degrees centigrade for an hour. That should turn them into a carbon. Then we're going to activate them, then we're going to make a supercapacitor out of them. Now, in order to carbonize these without burning them away, what we need to do is put them in a protective environment. Now, normally you find the protective environment to be argon gas. That's a bit difficult to arrange in a small home lab, so all I do with them is find a container, something that'll cope with 700-800 degrees centigrade. This will actually go up to 1000 degrees centigrade. Steel works just as well. Drop your material in your container, and what I've got here is an awful load of activated carbon, and all you do is cover them with activated carbon. There we go. We have created our protective environment. Now we need to put it into a kiln. This is the homemade kiln I made about 2 years ago, something like that. I put that mushrooms in there, turned it on to 700 degrees centigrade and just let it ramp itself up. It ramps quite quickly, sort of a degree or 2 a minute, something like that. Get it up to 700 degrees centigrade and then leave it for an hour. So once that's had an hour and time to cool down, we can pick it out and sift out our mushrooms. One thing that's really cool about this method actually is whatever organic material you put in there retains its shape. So the mushrooms are still there in mushroom shape. They've just shrunk a bit because they've lost the water, and there's a mushroom. So out of 250 grams of the raw mushrooms, we get 5 grams of carbonized mushrooms because mostly they're water. Now we want to take our carbonized mushrooms and grind them up into a very fine powder, and of course we can do that in a kitchen blender. We've got 250 grams of mushroom, we've got 5 grams of mushroom carbon, so the yield isn't great. Now we could activate this using potassium hydroxide, so you do something like a 4:1 weight ratio. So we've got 5 grams here over the carbon, and we'd add 20 grams of potassium hydroxide, heated at 700 degrees centigrade for an hour, and it would activate it. However, we'd only get about 20% yield. So we'd get 250 grams of that, 5 grams of that, and 1 gram of the activated carbon, which is not a huge amount when you think about it. But I'm going to make this into a supercapacitor paste anyway without the activation process. We'll see what we get. Now, in order to make it into a supercapacitor paste, all I really need to do is make it liquid and add a binder. And the binder I'm going to use is an acrylic binder. It's just an art binder. Usually, you add about 10% of the binder. So I'm going to add somewhere between 10 and 20% of this by weight. So half a gram, 1 gram of binder, and then make it up into a paste with some DI water. And that is our supercapacitor material. There we go, we've got our pretty paste. Now all I've got to do is put it onto something. I'm going to use a bit of graphite foil, slice off a section, paint some of this on, let it dry, and we will have our supercapacitor. So once it's dry, cut it in half so you've got two pieces. Then get a bit of kitchen towel, pop that in between, bit of electrolyte, pop that on top. Says here, if you don't drop it, there we go. Pop that on top like that, and that is a working supercapacitor. So let's give it a bit of charge and see if we can get something out of it. So there's my capacitor, a lump of wood and a little metal weight just to give it a bit of weight to keep everything in contact, and I'm going to charge it at 1.6 volts. So there we go, charging away. That's actually pretty awesome. Okay, if I disconnect that and connect a battery up to this little motor, we should see that motor spin. If there is nothing more than is proof of that, you open a door and there are surprising other doors to open and you can find all kinds of things. This mushroom exploration we're going on has to be exactly that, because of course I'm researching some of the ideas associated with these things just out of interest, and we've come across some really quite surprising things, but this one, I have to say, beats the pants off of anything else. It's astonishing. There's a big problem in the world today, and that is water. All you have to do is look at the fires in California, the droughts in Texas, and you realise that water is becoming quite a scarce commodity. Actually, it's fresh water because, of course, we've got a ton of seawater. The problem with seawater is you've got to take the salt out, and that is really energy intensive, and that makes it quite expensive to desalinate seawater. So getting fresh water from seawater is a huge challenge the world over. And desalinating spoilt water and groundwater that's got too much salt content is another huge challenge the world over. And what it's led to is the idea that solar steam generation would be able to answer those questions if we could find an efficient way of doing it. Now, solar steam generation is just the sun heats a surface, absorbs that heat, light energy, turns it into heat, and that will boil the water. Now this happens naturally, it happens just on the oceans, and it's a certain rate. It's about 0.5 kilogram per hour or something like that. I'll check that figure. But a group of scientists asked themselves a question, and who knows why they asked themselves this question. Probably because, like me, they were just interested in mushrooms, just like I asked this question. And they found that this thing is actually ideal. It's got a number of qualities that make it ideal. It's got a structure with a very thin cross section. The top cap underneath where it's white is relatively insulating. This bit here is dark and does a great absorption of solar. Even though they spend most of their life on the forest floor, they're actually brilliant at absorbing solar across this cap here. This bit here will pull up water through capillary action like you wouldn't believe. So they got one of these, it's a shiitake mushroom as it happens, stuck it in a beaker of water and shone a light on it. Turns out this will do solar evaporation at something like 2.5 times the efficiency of direct sun on water. And it does that because of the unique shape and structure of a mushroom. It's able to suck the water up through here. It's able to spread it through there without losing heat, and then it's able to evaporate it off the top of there because that is an efficient solar collector, which is astonishing. Because mostly, of course, these are used for food and they live in dark conditions. So the fact that that can do that so surprisingly efficiently, it's around about 78% efficiency that it does it, and about 2.5 times better than just shining it directly on water, is clearly an amazing result, and is opening doors to how we could create efficient solar steam for things like cheap desalination to help with the world's water problem. Now, some folks have used this as a springboard, obviously, and they've looked at the structure and said, okay, how can we replicate that structure? And what they've then done is carbonize the mushroom. Because when you do carbonisation, remember, you maintain the structure of the mushroom, as we've seen in things where we've done mushroom supercapacitors, but you make it black. And of course, there is no better colour at absorbing solar than black. So they've taken this stuff, carbonized it, put it into a disc and then floated it on a piece of wood, and found that they have this incredibly efficient solar steam generator for things like desalination based on mushrooms. Now then, we have two things from previous experiments that are going to help us in doing this to see if we can make an efficient solar evaporator. What we've got is some mushroom carbon that we made when we made a mushroom supercapacitor and charged and discharged it. It's just mushroom carbon in a binder. And we have this stuff. This is Oasis. Oasis actually is amazing stuff. It will suck water up like you wouldn't believe. So we're going to cut off some of this Oasis, paint the top with carbon, put some little legs on it, and that should be our solar evaporator. So let's get on with that. So here is my artificial mushroom. Now I've got thin legs, just like we'd have in a mushroom. We've got the cap and I've painted it with our mushroom carbon. And here I've got some water. If I stick that in there, then the water will get sucked up through the Oasis to this top part here. And we pop that in the sun. We can weigh that and see what that is to begin with, and then weigh it over time and see how much is lost by evaporation. Because we also need a control, which would just be a tray of water, exactly the same size and exactly the same weight. And now all we need to do is stick that in the sun and give it some time. That was somewhat awesome. Over about 4 hours, it did in fact evaporate roughly twice as much, which is pretty cool and pretty much in line with the research. Now, if you are interested in this, all you've got to do is go to Google Scholar and put fungi, solar steam, desalination, and you'll find a whole host of papers where they've been looking into this. And obviously, this is a real issue in the world, and so if it's something you wanted to work on, then it would certainly be something of great value. Mushrooms and fungi, perhaps one of the strangest of God's creations. It really is. Neither plant nor animal. And we have a sort of love-hate relationship with them. And this one is a common field mushroom, which is the mushroom we all know and eat with our fried up breakfast. But courtesy of all the cookery programs, of course, we're aware that there's an awful lot more of those mushrooms out there that you can eat. Now, there's something like 1.5 million species of mushrooms, of which only 20,000 of them produce few fruiting bodies like this. Now, if you were to look on the tree of life, then these things are closer to animals than they are plants. But they still leave us really a little afraid of them, because, of course, there are some of these things that can kill you, like fly agaric, for instance. And, of course, that breeds a degree of fear. And because we don't really recognize them, we don't know what we're eating. There are plenty of plants that can kill you if you eat them, but they're really readily recognizable. These things are a bit more difficult to recognize. Of course, another issue that we have with mushrooms and fungi is we associate them with rot. So fungi and mold grow on things and those things rot away. But of course, rot and the recycle of nutrients in that way is essential to the life of the earth. Otherwise, we'd be knee-deep in trash. Fungi come along, rot things away, put the nutrients back into circulation, and are essential for the health of the planet. Fungi are the ultimate survivor. There have been 6 cataclysmic extinctions in our history. And when there's been a cataclysmic extinction for whatever reason, being an asteroid hitting the Earth, etc., it's these things that have survived and come through basically unharmed. However, they have become the subject of intense interest. And there's so much you can do with this material, particularly myceli, which are the sort of roots that grow underground, that they've become the hot topic in science. Now, we have talked on other videos about how these have been used in space research to build spaceships, but perhaps one of the most well-known, if you like, things that these can do is you can make leather from them. Historically speaking, the production of leather has been tremendously important, particularly with horses. When you're around horses, the amount of leather trappings that you've got to have is enormous, with all these saddles and the bridles and the bags and the straps. Just a ton of need for leather, and so leather was a stupendously important industry, so much so that just about every village had its own tannery. The issue with leather production is it's quite possibly the most horrendous thing to have to do. It can take something like 15 months for a whole team of people to turn a hide into leather goods. So the amount of time it takes to produce something from leather is long, and the process is horrendous. When the hide is first collected, stripped from the animal, it's salted so that it won't rot, basically, between its collection and its curing. So the first stage in leather production is to soak that hide in a bath of lime. That lime bath is about 2 weeks, and it cleans out the salt, loosens the fat, and starts to dissolve the hair, because the fat and the hair have to be removed, and they're just disgusting jobs. Removing the hair after that 2 weeks process means putting it on a beam, getting a knife and scraping it off. Now the hair scrapes off relatively easily, but you have to flip it over and scrape off the fat. Scraping off the fat is perhaps one of the most disgusting jobs that mankind has ever invented. It's sticky, smelly, grotesque, but has to be done. Once the hair and the fat have been removed, that remaining skin has to be soaked in a pickling or baiting solution, which is a bacterial solution that loosens the collagen fibres. It used to be made of a mix of warm water, urine and chicken or dog poop bacterial content, and that was saved for weeks, because the more bacteria that was in there, the more it would work. And of course that was incredibly smelly, and the whole village could stink of the tannery in a hot summer's day. That was just the pre-processing. After all that was done, of course, it had to go through the tanning process, and then, of course, a softening process before it could be turned into leather goods. So taking an animal skin and turning that animal skin into leather was tremendously important, tremendously time-consuming, and perhaps one of the most hideous jobs ever. So clearly, it would become a target for a replacement if a replacement could be found. And it turns out that these things are able to replace leather. Of course, this is a chestnut mushroom, so not that one particularly, but there's a kind of mushroom, a kind of fungus called kombucha. Kombucha has become very popular. If you leave the kombucha to grow, and it will produce a kind of fizzy drink, a kombucha tea, and that's supposed to be great for your health. All that aside, as it does that, it grows something called a SCOBY, which is the mushroom body, and that's a kind of flat, slimy sheet of fungus. That SCOBY can be turned into a leather-like material really relatively simply. All you actually do is put the SCOBY onto a drying frame, dry it when it becomes actually quite brittle and parchment-like. Once you've dried it, you can then oil it. When you've oiled it and let the oil soak in, what you get is a material that is tremendously like leather, incredibly strong, and can be stitched in the same way that leather can be stitched. And you're finding people growing these scobies and making jackets out of it, making shoes and bags out of it, because it is an ideal leather replacement. Now it is in fact a cellulose. It's a long chain cellulose. But it's such a good replacement for leather that that industry is growing rapidly. The issue that people think there is with it is the time it takes a SCOBY to grow, because the thicker the SCOBY grows, then the more leather-like it becomes. So if you leave it for a couple of weeks, you'll get a thin parchment-like material. If you leave it for a couple of months, you get a pretty chunky, sturdy bit of SCOBY that you can dry into a fairly thick, tough piece of leather. But what they're not bearing in mind is that the leather process itself took 15 months. So if you're growing a SCOBY for 12 months, you're actually quicker than the leather making industry. And so leather from SCOBY and leather from a fungus has become an important replacement product, an important potential replacement. Because of course, to grow a cow, you need to feed that thing on a field for absolutely ages. And then of course we slaughter something like 100,000 a year here in England just to provide the leather for the leather goods. And then we have all the pollution and stink associated with tanneries. So kombucha, the SCOBY, as a potential for leather replacement actually shows great promise. So there we go. It would appear that mushrooms can be magic in more sense than one. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video and found it interesting. Thank you very much for watching, and please do remember to like and subscribe.